Back in August, Jacob Zenn wrote a report for EER called Boko Haram's Moderate Streak and Nigeria's Counterterrorism Conundrum. Jacob is an adjunct fellow adjunct assistant professor at the graduate level course Violent Non-State Actors in World Politics at Georgetown University's Security Studies program, and a senior fellow on African and Eurasian Affairs at Jamestown Foundation. He's conducted extensive fieldwork in West Africa, which has helped him map the organizational structure of Boko Haram. He publishes regularly in scholarly journals, and his most recent book is Unmasking Boko Haram. So most people probably first heard of this group when it kidnapped the schoolgirls in Chibok in April 2014. And of those 300 girls, I think 100 are actually still in captivity. But as you lay out in the report, they actually originated about a decade earlier. So can you just take us to that origin point?
Yeah, I believe the origin of Boko Haram is actually in 1994, because at that time there was a synthesis of two different trend lines. One was that Nigerians began joining the Algerian Armed Islamic Group, or the GIA, and some Nigerians who were actually living in diaspora in Saudi Arabia began joining Al-Qaeda. And over the course of the next decade, they began intermingling with Nigerians in Nigeria itself, making contacts in the Nigerian Salafi community. And that mixture, combined with the events of 9/11 and the inspiration that that gave to that community, as well as Nigeria's counterterrorism responses after 9/11, really led the group to blossom in 2004 under Muhammad Yusuf, who was acknowledged as the group's founder. And he led the group until he was killed in 2009. And that's when they began officially fighting their jihad under Abu Bakr Shekau. And then, as you noted, in 2014, there was the Chibok kidnapping, which put them on the international landscape. And then in 2015, they joined ISIS, which put them on the international landscape of the global jihadi community.
There's been some controversy, I think. I say controversy, there's at least been a debate or discussion about the Al-Qaeda links to the early phase of Boko Haram. Could you explain how that works?
Yes, I maintain, and I add to what I have maintained, that the Al-Qaeda link is also important in 1994, which I previously had not realized. But in some research I've done over the past year, I've become more confident that you need to factor in Nigerians in Al-Qaeda outside of Nigeria, basically diaspora Nigerians in Al-Qaeda, into the networks that ended up forming a jihadi movement in Nigeria after 1994. And that's based on some documents that not even those who disagree with me have seen yet, but they rely on some Guantanamo detainee assessments. And I have an academic article on that scheduled for only a few weeks or months from now until it's published. So that can enhance that debate. But I also think that the first confrontation between the Nigerian government and the group that we know as Boko Haram in 2003, at the end of that year, also relates to Al-Qaeda, because some of the leaders of the so-called local jihadi movement in 2003 were actually involved with Al-Qaeda, as opposed to being, say, local university students who are frustrated by the lack of job opportunities, which is part of what the other side of the debate suggests. And I also think that Al-Qaeda comes into play when you consider the rapid acceleration of suicide bombings by the group in 2011 and 12. Typically, when a group that previously did not conduct suicide bombings starts conducting them, especially at such a rapid pace, it involves outside training. And in Boko Haram's case, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest it was Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, if not also Al-Shabaab. And it's also important to look at the Al-Qaeda connection when you consider the group being massacred by the government in 2009 and then reemerging very quickly in 2010. And there's a lot of letters and video documentation of key members of the group going to the Sahel after 2009 and telling Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, hey, we need help. And then Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb said yes for financial, training, weapons, and other forms of support, including propaganda to Boko Haram. And then it began accelerating in 2010 back home in Nigeria. And surprisingly to me was that before Abu Bakr Shekau, the wild leader, died a few months ago, his final audio indicated that he had actually pledged loyalty to Al-Qaeda, which was a step that we had not known about until this audio emerged only months ago.
Within a slight sidetrack, but within the Algerian jihad in the 1990s, did the Nigerian contingent that goes on to become Boko Haram, were they within GIA or were they within the factions that broke away and started fighting against them?
From all that we know, they were in the GIA, but they were operating mostly in Niger and perhaps Mali, and maybe only a very few of them in Algeria itself. So they were definitely part of the rear guard, supplying weapons and interacting with some of the members of the GIA who would later become part of the GSPC, like Belmokhtar and Abu Zaid. So although they were part of the GIA network, I don't know if I would qualify them as firm members of the group that were involved in those factional, fratricidal disputes up in Algeria itself. They were really more logistics, but that did get them involved with the jihadi networks that became very important for them in the future, which were those of the Sahelian Algerian jihadists, Sahel-based Algerian jihadists like Belmokhtar, Abu Zaid, Yahya Jouadi, and so forth.
Interesting. So you've already touched on this a bit, but one of the things I think that's confused a lot of people that don't follow it very closely is just the sheer nomenclature of it, because obviously even Boko Haram is not a name they chose themselves. I don't know if they particularly recognize it now, but that's how the university know it. But after they joined Islamic State, and then part of the group broke away and rebelled against the central command, this got even more confusing. So can you just kind of lay out that lay of the land for us?
Without making this any more confusing than it needs to be, at the present time, for the most part, when you say Boko Haram, you are referring to Islamic State in West Africa Province, or ISWA, which is the group that is loyal to and affiliated with the Islamic State. Previously, at least even last year, the group Jamaat Ahl Sunnah li Dawati wal Jihad was led by Abu Bakr Shekau, and that group was also called Boko Haram. And that was a somewhat more ruthless group and somewhat more localistic group. But ever since Abu Bakr Shekau was killed by ISWA around May of this year, that group that I just mentioned, Jamaat Ahl Sunnah li Dawati wal Jihad, has really become weakened. Some of its members have joined ISWA, and there are some members still lurking around Lake Chad that still are fighting in the banner of that group and in the legacy of Shekau. But it seems like it's on the down and out, even though it might be trying to revive itself also in northwestern Nigeria. So I wouldn't count out that group, but certainly not as big as ISWA. And then you also have this group called Ansaru, or Ansar al-Muslimin fi Bilad al-Sudan. And this group is active basically only in northwestern Nigeria now. And this is a Al-Qaeda sub-affiliate. And although people call them Boko Haram, they also have their own name, Ansaru. But they're also very small. So just as the only really big group right now that's really threatening Nigeria's security in a major way is ISWA. And it's still commonly known as Boko Haram. Although it's worth noting that these other two factions could see an uptick, and that even Ansaru released a video, or has a video that it plans to release from northwestern Nigeria coming out very soon. And it shows that these other factions are still at least trying to compete with ISWA.
Ansaru, from my reading, I'm actually not sure if it's in the report, but from your other work I've read, has operated as kind of a special forces type group. It's as you say, it's small in itself, but it's a force multiplier, if you like, as an organization.
That's right. Ansaru was more of an AQIM extension into Nigeria, both ideologically in terms of the fact that they try not to kill innocent Muslim civilians like Shekau was doing. And they also had a very high level of training consistent with their experience in the Sahel. So they were able to carry out targeted attacks like a special forces brigade would do, but not widespread attacks that a more grassroots movement, such as that of Abu Bakr Shakal, was able to do in the Northeast. So their numbers were smaller, but their sophistication was higher. But when some of their more sophisticated members were eliminated or captured, then the group became pretty weak because they didn't have masses of foot soldiers to rely on. And that's basically their status now as they try to revive themselves in the Northwest.
Are they still working with ISWA, or have they sided with the remnants of Shakal's?
It seems that they're pretty autonomous now, that they're unlikely to work with ISWAP. ISWAP had been accepting their members, but they were required to defect at a point when ISWAP was somewhat conciliatory toward Ansarud because they both were more moderate than Shakal. But as of now, it doesn't seem like there's any cooperation between any of the factions, really, except for defectors joining ISWAP in that direction from both Shakal and from Ansarud, at least previously.
So in the report, you lay out 4 instances where the moderate and more extreme wings of the group clashed. Could you give us an overview of how that went down?
About what went down?
The 4 instances you gave of the moderate and extreme wings of the group clashing.
Oh, in terms of the extremities of the Boko Haram movement, you would say Shakal was the most extreme, harboring an ideology consistent with the hardcore takfiris in the global jihadi movement, basically considering anyone who did not join his group as an infidel because they refused to wage jihad. And he had little problem with killing them or abducting women that were not part of his group, even Muslim, and making them slaves, and even deploying girls in suicide bombings. So Shakal was definitely very extreme. As a result of that, you had Ansarud break away, and Ansarud said, we're not going to harm innocent Muslim civilians or even ordinary Muslim civilians who don't join the jihad. We will only harm Muslims who are actively fighting us. And at least for what they said, they wouldn't harm Christians that were just living their lives, but they would harm Christians that were proselytizing or joining the army. ISWAP took a similar attitude towards Ansarud, and they've more or less upheld it, but ISWAP itself has had some internal factional rifts, which are with more hardcore factions and more moderate factions. And it seems that the more hardcore factions have actually won out in ISWAP. And although they're not nearly as extreme as Shakal was, they do have the capacity to conduct massacres. Although even those massacres are usually only against Muslims who will be targeting the group as part of vigilante groups. ISWAP still will generally not harm ordinary Muslim civilians.
In terms of the Christian aspect, the sectarian dimension, just for obviously people who are watching, that Nigeria is mostly Muslim in the north and Christian in the south. Is that kind of limited by their simple geography, that they're not on that borderline, or would they ideologically refrain from that kind of thing? The faction that went out in ISWAP, I mean.
Yeah, I think the highest level of intensity of the Muslim-Christian contestation, insofar as Boko Haram was concerned, was about 10 years ago in 2011 and 2012, because at that time, Shakal's fighters were active in central Nigeria, where many Christians live. So they were really able to focus their suicide bombings on Christian churches. And at that time, the guys who trained with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb were still with Shakal for the most part. They hadn't really formed Ansarud, so they could use their suicide bombing specialty or car bombing specialty to target churches. But since then, the group has really receded from central Nigeria. So now the Christians that are mostly in their area of operations are in places like Chibok. And these are indigenous Christians in places like Borno. And they get harassed for sure by ISWAP's more hardcore leadership now, with their churches destroyed, their villages destroyed, and at least until he died, by Shakal as well. But this is more localized targeting of Christians, whereas 10 years ago when they targeted Christians, it was in very high profile attacks that the entire nation saw. So it really riled the nation. And of course, the Chibok kidnapping did that too in the Northeast. But we haven't seen anything on that scale since 2014. And although Ansarud was originally formed in central Nigeria, where there are many Christians, and it intended to sort of protect Muslims from Christians in its own words, Now Answer is much more integrated in the far northwest of Nigeria, somewhat away from the Christians in central Nigeria, and it's more integrated with bandits. And although it still states that it attacks Christians, it's not doing so in any dramatic fashion that could capture the national attention and cause a national level controversy.
Probably just a follow-up question on that. Do they have a kind of an overarching program, say in the way that Zarqawi did, that he thought the way to victory in Iraq was to ignite a sectarian war? Do they have that, or are they content to kind of run their area?
Yeah, that sort of Zarqawi ideology of starting a sectarian war also seemed to have existed in 2012. I don't think Shekau was as strategic as Zarqawi about it. I just think he wanted to target Christians because they were infidels, and he didn't really think about starting a sectarian war that would force Muslims to join his side, even if they originally would not have wanted to wage a jihad. That actually didn't really happen at the end of the day, and I don't think he thought enough about it. He just wanted to kill Christians. And for their part, Christians really did not retaliate much to the attacks against them. They sort of took the attacks. And although that must have been difficult because tensions were high, it did seem to help there not to be reprisals and a cycle of violence caused by what Shekau was doing.
You end the report by noting that the victory of the more moderate wing of the group has actually left the Nigerian state in something of a quandary. I mean, it's more difficult to handle this group. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so at the time of writing the report, it did appear that ISWA is more moderate than Shekau, and ISWA had just defeated Shekau. It's worthy to note that since ISWA defeated Shekau, Abu Musab al-Barnawi himself has been reported killed, and he sort of headed the more moderate wing of ISWA. And that happened a couple months ago, maybe 3 months ago. So I would fear, in a sense, that ISWA will move in a more hardcore direction, especially because it's now increasingly acquiring Shekau's members. So it might have some more hardcore members coming into its ranks. But nonetheless, the fact that ISWA defeated Shekau and more or less eliminated him means that the most hardcore, ruthless jihadi leader is now eliminated from the picture. And that means Nigeria is dealing with a group like ISWA that is better militarily than Shekau, that has the wisdom from a strategic perspective amongst certain leaders to engage the population in a civilian-centric way and to avoid killing Muslims in a way that would alienate them. So Nigeria is now dealing with a much more complex enemy that is better strategically and better militarily. Whereas when it was fighting Shekau, it was fighting a more ruthless foe who was worse for civilians, but in that sense, it was sort of better for the army because it would make sure that civilians would never join Shekau. And Shekau was not that great strategically, as we just mentioned, with this 2012 violence. And so there was tough combat with Shekau, but you maybe would not be outsmarted by Shekau. But now that Shekau's out of the picture, you're dealing with ISWA that has the awareness that it needs to win the civilian support and that it needs to do that better than the military, which Shekau never did. And as I just mentioned, they also have a lot of good fighters. One of the key questions will be, how can ISWA integrate late Shekau's fighters without becoming too much like Shekau? And whether the hardcore leaders of ISWA will end up winning out the internal factional rivalry in ISWA and end up sort of becoming like Shekau himself. I don't think that's likely, though. I think they'll still maintain this moderate enough persuasion that they will be able to vie for civilian influence, and they'll still maintain military power. And it's really not clear at this time how Nigeria is going to grapple with that.
Have ISWA got very deep connections with the other Islamic State presence on the continent, namely the Central African province, which is down in Congo and in Mozambique, and I'm assuming there are other groups in the Sahel as well, or other cells at least. Do they have much of a connection with that infrastructure?
Right now, it seems that most of the IS, Islamic State provinces in Africa, have a pretty strong connection to Islamic State center, but they don't have a very strong connection to each other in terms of dialogue or meeting. So most of the guidance and training and media support and strategic discussion happens straight up with IS to each of the provinces, as opposed to the provinces helping each other out. Maybe they were intended to help each other out, but just amid international counterterrorism pressure, it's just too difficult for them to travel across some pretty far distances to meet each other.
If you were looking ahead 6 or 12 months with Nigeria, what would be the trend lines you would say you can either see or would be the things to keep an eye on?
The main trend line, I think, is still this stalemate where there are some things that ISWAP just cannot do right now in the near-term future, which is, say, conquer or take over a major barracks. They've already taken over the small ones, but they're just stuck. They can't take over the major ones. And there's other things that the Nigerian army can't do. They can't get ISWAP out of these rural territories that it controls, but they can protect their major towns and their major barracks. So you're just in this stalemate. Now, part of what the paper that I wrote for IER indicated was that over the long term, this type of stalemate is, I think, favorable to ISWAP, because it's just going to embed itself more and more in the rural areas, recruit more in the rural areas, have children amongst its fighters, and really develop a very powerful army. So that's why I think in 6 to 12 months, they still cannot take over a military barracks. But maybe in 6 years, they can. And I think the stalemate is really, really solid right now, where both sides are sort of content with what they have, and they know that they don't have the capability to do what they want to do. So they're just in the stalemate. But I do think you need to think more long-term about how the stalemate is actually in ISWAP's favor. And the Nigerian army really needs to think about what it's going to do to try to change that, especially because, as we noted, ISWAP is, for the most part, trying to be friendly in the civilian areas, and that will give it very robust control over rural areas that it will leverage to its own opportunities in the long-term future.
In terms of the international dimension to this, international counterterrorism reaction, there isn't an international presence, I don't think, in Nigeria in the way that, say, the French are in Mali or something. But I'm assuming there is assistance in Nigeria in some way.
Yes, there's assistance with the Air Force and acquisition of warplanes and other types of weaponry. But Nigeria has always been quite protective of its sovereignty compared to other countries, so it has not welcomed that type of international presence in Nigeria. And if I look at it comparatively, several years ago, there was some greater intention, I think, from the United States and perhaps European powers to really support the Nigerian army. But perhaps after being rebuffed or not really getting a great welcome, and as a result of reports of human rights abuses from the soldiers, I think this type of international support has decreased, or at least the interest has sort of decreased. And then when you look at the situation in Afghanistan and the problems that went on there, sort of the political will to commit to international counterterrorism support to a nation like Nigeria is less. So I think almost more than ever, when you think about the last 10 years, this is really a Nigerian fight against mostly ISWAP, as opposed to in the past where I think you had a greater level of international assistance. And perhaps COVID even affects that, because you used to have these CVE and PVE type of programs to deal with ideological aspects, some humanitarian aspects, community building against extremism. But I imagine with COVID, those programs are more difficult to carry out in a place like Nigeria. So that form of assistance, I suspect, is also less than it used to be.
I guess the final question is, if you were recommending this kind of thing, like the interventions, either military or otherwise, are there actually things that the international community could do to help, or is it, I mean, if you make the assumption there was political will, which, as you say, it's fading.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very strange scenario, because my assessment is that this stalemate is very rigid. And Nigeria, at least for the next 5 years, I would think, can protect the main towns in the heartland of the violence in Borno. and it can protect its barracks. It has the weapons, it has the manpower for that. And the question is, if we're going to go into the rural areas of Borno, which is sort of ISWAP territory, how can the international community support that? Because I think Nigeria, at least for now, has the other aspects under its control, protecting barracks, protecting major towns. And I would just start with that question. How can the international community help Nigeria in the rural areas? Now, you do have some organizations like ICRC, these very humanitarian and neutrally aligned ones, and I think they can help Nigerians in ISWAP-controlled areas, providing medicines and food and other types of things that the people need there. That doesn't necessarily help the Nigerian army in its own objective to recapture those areas. But if we think from a civilian perspective, I think the international community can probably find ways to deal with ISWAP to help the civilians under its control. But if you're talking about how can the international community help defeat ISWAP, I think that's a question that really remains to be answered, but it's one that can be asked. And you really need to think about how can they actually go into rural areas where ISWAP knows the language, knows the territory, knows the people much better than even the Nigerian army, very possibly, let alone international supporters. And I think that's a question you need to grapple with.
Thank you very much for doing this. Where can people follow your work?
You can follow me on Twitter. That's probably the best place. My handle should be @BokoWatch, BOKOWATCH. And if you follow me, you can DM me and we can continue the conversation, or you could email me at jacobzenn@gmail.com.
Excellent. Thank you very much for doing this.
Okay, it was a real pleasure to have this conversation. I look forward to the next opportunity.